Peterson is probably now North America's most popular public intellectual, probably by a mile. He has spent many decades studying tyranny and its antecedents. And as a result, he frequently warns his audiences of the dangers of ideological possession. Now, as someone who's been, in my own small way, talking and writing about this most prevalent of epistemic diseases, I am delighted to see all the attention that is being paid to it, thanks to Jordan Peterson. Now, ideological possession is to healthy political and moral discourse as scientism is to science. Now, the most important thing to know about diagnosing this disease of ideological possession is that you can't do it just by looking at the content of the possessing ideology, i.e. you can't just find out what somebody believes to determine if they're ideologically possessed. As I have said elsewhere in videos and articles, it's not so much the content of your belief that makes you dangerous as it is the way you believe it, i.e. whether you are ideologically possessed or on that spectrum. Now, any ideology has the potential to be deadly when advanced by those who are so sure of their own knowledge and moral outlook that they would impose it against the protestations of those affected by it. To the ideologically possessed, the imposition can always be justified because, quote, it's the right thing to do, or, quote, it will start working if we keep at it, or, quote, the complaints are coming only from bad people so we can ignore them, and so on. And yes, in all of those kind of ideologically possessed responses to objections to somebody's ideology, the logic is circular. So anyway, with apologies to Dr. Peterson and an open invitation for him to correct anything I'm about to say, he is the clinician after all, here for diagnostic purposes and with my tongue only half in my cheek, is a list of symptoms of ideological possession, that most fatal of epistemic diseases. Now, before I get to the list, just a couple of cautions and caveats. The symptoms of ideological possession manifest differently according to the possessing ideology. So for illustrative purposes, the following list of symptoms is offered with some example manifestations, labeled to indicate their association with so-called progressive or so-called conservative or so-called libertarian possessing ideologies. Now, to be fair, it is not the case, of course, that all people who present with the manifestations that I'm going to offer as examples are exhibiting symptoms of ideological possession. It is, after all, quite possible to hold apparently simplistic or radical views that are very carefully arrived at with an open mind, with good data, and with intellectual honesty. For example, the fact that someone believes the world is out to get them doesn't necessarily mean they're paranoid. More interestingly, perhaps, as the old saw goes, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that the world is out to get you. Nevertheless, believing that the world is out to get you is a good diagnostic marker for paranoia, the two being highly causally correlated. So with that caution, with that disclaimer, the manifestations below are offered because I've witnessed them all in the not too distant past. And when I did so, for various reasons, I felt that, let's say, they were symptomatic or reflective of at least the early onset of that disease, ideological possession. So here is a list of symptoms of ideological possession for diagnostic purposes. Let's start with the major symptoms. A possessed person, an ideologically possessed person, may insist that anyone who disfavors a specific view or policy must also reject the basic moral value that, to the possessed person, justifies that view or policy. I call this the fallacy of the assumed paradigm. And here are some example manifestations that I've heard recently. From a libertarian, if you won't let mothers protect their children with guns, you're a misogynist. From a conservative, people who favor gun control don't value freedom. And from a progressive, people against regulating firearms don't care about violence against children. There you go. The symptom, the general, and the specific manifestations. All right, here's another symptom. An ideologically possessed person often will use one-dimensional labels for people they've never met and who clearly aren't one-dimensional as a means of dismissing the value of all their beliefs and actions. Here's a few examples I've heard recently. One from a libertarian: Churchill was a mass murderer. From a conservative: Gandhi was a pedophile. And from a progressive: Thatcher was a witch. Again, they're empirical claims that reasonable people who aren't ideologically possessed can discuss, but when I encountered them, as is so often the case with claims of that kind, they were used really to dismiss, not to have a serious discussion, but to kind of shut one down. Okay. Now, related to the last couple of symptoms, a possessed person will often regard a few quotes or actions by an individual as proof that the individual is evil, without regard to context, appreciation that everyone is a product of his time, recognition that people change their views over time, or even consideration of other quotes and actions that provide evidence against the claimed ill intent of the individual in question. Here's the next symptom. A possessed person will often advocate worse treatment of people within a specified group than others. From a progressive, I've heard straight white men have privilege and so should have their opinions discounted or suppressed. From a libertarian, people who work for the state initiate violence, and it is okay to do violence against those who initiate it. From a conservative, people who burn the flag are traitors and should be punished as such. Next symptom. The possessed person will often believe that a single principle provides answers to most important moral and political questions, disregarding reasonable moral intuitions to the contrary, precisely because they are to the contrary, and any uncertainty regarding the precise meaning or application of the principle. From progressives, equality. From libertarians, non-aggression. From some religious conservatives, biblical authority. Okay, and again, please understand, I'm not saying that those who hold up equality, non-aggression, or biblical authority are inherently ideologically possessed. Didn't get that? Rewind this and go back to my caveats and cautions that I gave before this list of major symptoms. All right, here's the last major symptom. When the results of an ideologically justified action are the opposite of those intended or used to justify that action in the first place, the ideologically possessed individual is convinced that not only is the action not the cause of any resulting problem, but that more of the same action will eventually solve that problem. So this is why you hear from progressives, Venezuela needs more socialism. Or from conservatives, we need more unprovoked military involvement in conflicts that don't involve us. Or from libertarians, Europe should open its borders immediately to everyone. Now here's some minor symptoms. These are kind of everyday symptoms and you see them all the time. The possessed enjoys opportunities to defend what he believes more than opportunities to make his beliefs more accurate. The possessed collects data that support her beliefs instead of seeking data that would help her correct false beliefs. The possessed offers unsolicited opinions without any empathic engagement with the recipient or any interest in whether the recipient is in any state to be positively influenced by them. And the last symptom of all, the possessed would rather reform society's institutions to better serve his ideology than to reform his ideology to better serve people. So let's talk about the immunity, pathology, and cure of this disease. Fortunately, the epistemic immune system of most mentally healthy people protects them from ideological possession. The core of the immune response, and indeed an effective cure for the disease, is love of truth. Specifically, the holding of truth as the highest moral value. Pathologically, ideological possession may even be understood as the substitution of that highest value by another. Love of truth, in fact, provides a near perfect protection against ideological possession because the disease, while deadly, has no defense against the honest admission by the afflicted of his or her symptoms. Nevertheless, the most pernicious and subtle feature of ideological possession prevents the possessed from seeking treatment or treating himself. Ideological possession, you see, can disguise itself in the mind of the afflicted as that very same love of truth that in its authentic form would in fact cure it. What conditions then enable those in the grip of ideological possession, whose love of truth may have already been replaced by a counterfeit, to cure themselves? To answer that, I believe it is important to understand the symbiotic relationship between the disease and the host. Although epidemics of ideological possession can be fatal to entire societies, the disease provides immediate benefits to the individual who suffers from it, such as intellectual certainty and stability, feelings of moral superiority, an apparent simplification of life's difficult decisions and questions, avoidance of true moral responsibility, and a sense of belonging among others similarly afflicted. All of these tend to prevent self-treatment. Accordingly, the cures for ideological possession tend to be external and unsought. They nevertheless exist and fall into two broad categories: fast cures and slow cures. Fast cures tend to be triggered by a catastrophic failure of one or more of the benefits to the afflicted individual that I just outlined. This may occur when, despite the highly motivated perception and reasoning of the possessed individual, she experiences an unexpected, painful, and even shocking outcome of an ideologically motivated action. The painful shock activates that love of truth for long enough to locate the cause of the pain, forcing the afflicted to admit the symptoms and therefore identify the disease for what it is, affecting the rapid cure. Slow cures tend to involve a rising awareness by one afflicted individual of the same disease in friends or others with whom she identifies. This can be induced when the individual sees inconsistencies in those others' words and actions that cause direct harm to others and to the stated goals of the possessing ideology. Now, in theory, of course, this slow cure could be induced by observations of one's own actions under ideological possession. But this is prevented by the self-righteousness that is felt when one acts in the grip of the disease. So let's end by talking about maintaining good epistemic health. To protect oneself from the terrible epistemic disease of ideological possession, epistemic nutrition and exercise are extremely effective. With respect to the former, the regular consumption of great thinkers like J.S. Mill, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that, George Orwell, to see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle, and Dostoevsky, nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer, nothing is more difficult than to understand him. A diet of thinkers like that will keep you in good epistemic health. Supplement these basics with a more varied diet of thinkers with whom you disagree on things that you care about, and you'll be in even better shape. With respect to the latter, epistemic exercise, a comfortable regime of epistemic exercise that takes a little time and effort but is immediately rewarding involves maintaining real friendships with people who have very different assumptions, experiences, and declared moral and political priorities from your own. And if all that sounds a little hard to do, it really isn't. Because the good news is, if you're chasing truth hard enough, it is very unlikely that the disease of ideological possession will ever catch up with you.